Let's get started. Today, our topic is the 1921 census of England and Wales on Ancestry. And I have, for the first time on one of our virtual events, two very special guests, and I'm very excited to introduce them. I'll let them give you a little bit more about themselves. But Lisa Cook is here with me. She is from our content team. And Lisa, how long have you been here with Ancestry?
As of April 1st, it will be 11 years.
That's amazing. And with the content team the whole time?
Yes, I started out as a project manager. Now I'm a program manager with our strategy team.
That's fantastic. And tell us a little bit about your English ancestry. Do you have people in the 1921 census?
I do. I have had most of my ancestors have been in the United States since like the 1880s, 1860s. So I wasn't sure if I would find anyone, but I actually found my third great grandparents in there. And my third great grandmother, because my third great grandfather died in 1920. So it was kind of a really fun opportunity to find out where she went after he passed. And it actually led me to identify who one of her children married, and now I've got another line of cousins to dig through. So
Well, that's so fun. I love that. I did not know that story. Well, Lisa's here to join us to talk a little bit about content and some of the ways that she has discovered some things in the census, and the three of us will all share some tips and tricks as we go. Also joining us today is Simon Pierce. Now, one of the things you all may not know is that Ancestry has about 1,300 employees. Our company headquarters are in Lehi, Utah, but we do have offices around the world, including in England, and that is where Simon is joining us from. Simon, I'm so glad you're here. Tell us a little bit about how long you've been with Ancestry and what you do here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I can't wait to delve into the 21 census. But yeah, my name's Simon Pierce. I work in the Ancestry London office. I've been with the company for 9 years now. I've moved around different departments, but my background is military research and helping people research their family history. And I love just getting into the records and finding people's stories. And yeah, just I bet at home many of you have been looking at the 21 census, finding your ancestors and finding incredible stories. And we've got some to share today, which I'm really looking forward to doing. So an amazing collection, and I can't wait to get started.
That's fantastic. So I'm actually really excited. Simon, I interviewed Simon a few weeks ago for my podcast, so we've had some time on camera together before.
Mm.
Lisa, I don't think you and I have. We might have to remedy that.
oh, I've got stories I can share.
I might need to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I loved it.
Okay. Well, so today we're here to talk about the 1921 census of England and Wales. So in addition to this being the first time that I've had guests with me on the virtual event Wednesday, this is also the first time that we have spent an entire virtual event session, which will go for about an hour, talking about one specific record collection. And one of the reasons we thought that this was a good idea for you all was so that you could just really dial into how Ancestry publishes records, how we index them, how we make them searchable, and then also what you can find when you really dig deep into a singular record collection. Now, that said, if you do not have family in the 1921 census, like Lisa, like Simon, like myself, that's okay. There are still some tips and tricks, I think, both broadly about how Ancestry indexes and makes records searchable and findable, and also about some search tips and tricks that you can take to apply to the specific records that are of value to you and your family history journey. So whether you have family in the 1921 census or not, I think that this will be some valuable time spent. So Lisa, let's go ahead and start with you. Just talk a little bit about Ancestry's process of getting these records online, making them searchable, and feel free to share whatever you want, both verbally and on screen if you've got things for us.
Awesome. We're so excited to have the 1921 census. I mean, anybody who's watched any topics you've ever covered on YouTube or on your podcast or on these virtual events knows that censuses are just a gold mine of ways to build your tree and learn more about your ancestors and give you little tips of where to look for more information, right? That's my favorite thing about censuses, that they have so much information packed into one little form usually. So we're super excited to add this to our site and to see how it works with all of the other collections on Ancestry. So I know a lot of people live off hints, right? You get your hints. I want to talk a little bit about how to search the specific census and kind of show you how it's presented on the website, whether you have a lot of familiarity with looking at the records directly, or if you just go by hints. I just want to share really quickly kind of what it looks like.
So
So,
as you do that, Lisa, can you just make sure to, well, or I'll explain to people while you're sharing your screen and getting ready. One of the things that a lot of new people don't know, right? You mentioned like they chase hints, which is great. That's one of the reasons Ancestry provides them to you all for that low-hanging fruit. But sometimes you have to dive into a census for a specific reason. Can you explain why some records don't hint?
yes, definitely. So basically, we hint records based on which fields are indexed and how they match up with other records in our algorithm. So if we have the same name, we have the same birthplace, it has a relationship, those are things that will help a record hint. And generally censuses will hint really well because they have a lot of that information. But a lot of records don't hint as well. Sometimes employment records won't have a birth date on them. So that is a crucial piece of information that helps our algorithm identify that it's the right person. Sometimes you will have records that don't have a discrete place that we can map to, or sometimes the names are slightly different. So hints are great. They're amazing. I have found so many awesome things for them, but they're obviously not the only way you can find records. And there are some really cool records you can find if you look deeper into the collection. And I just wanted to start on the card catalog. If you know Krista, you know the card catalog is like
My
gold,
favorite
right?
thing.
I'm actually on the .co UK site, so if you see it looks a little bit different, that might be why. Um, we do have so we have the Census of England, Wales, Channel Islands, and Isle of Man. Those are all in 4 separate collections. If you want to search them individually, there is also a group page for that I can pull up later to show you. If you're on the UK site, it's really easy to get to. If you're on the US site, it's a little trickier.
Okay, and I'm going to interrupt you just for a minute and ask Simon a really quick question while we're staring at this page, because I think it's important that you pointed out that we've got these 4, the census is broken out into 4 different unique databases. But Simon, I'm seeing a question come up a little bit in the chat, and I think I saw it at least once in the Q&A. Why is Scotland missing from this collection?
Well, I guess like how long have you got? And I'm sure my colleagues that specialize in Scottish research can answer that. But England and Wales are tied together more closely through their governance and legislation. So that's why we have England and Wales. Scotland's a little bit different. Maybe worth digging online for that one there. But yeah, we have England and Wales. But there's no all's not lost, because you may find that your Scottish ancestors may have come down to England, to Wales to work, perhaps to the northeast of England, different industries. So although you may think, oh, I might not find my Scottish ancestors, worth having a look in the census just in case they left home and sought work in England and Wales as well.
Okay, so yeah, good a tip there. And yeah, the Scottish government just manages the census for themselves, and that means that their government website, which is where most of their records live, by the way, gets put on their site, and they don't allow a lot of records to be placed elsewhere online. So, okay, Lisa, keep going.
All right, I'm going to click on, I want to look at the England census. You can see the record counts over here, so you can tell that's the bulk of the records. Obviously, if you have ancestors and you know they're from Wales or the Channel Islands or Isle of Man, you can go directly to those. My people happen to be in England, so I'm going to click on that one.
Okay, and while this page is loading, you mentioned why we might not hint to records that don't have more data, but why might a census record, like why might I not get a hint for a census record for my 3rd great grandmother if we do hints in census records well?
Yeah. One of the things I mentioned is the name might have been transcribed incorrectly. There might just not be quite enough matching information if your ancestor moved and doesn't appear where we expect them to be. Kind of like Simon was saying, our algorithm is looking for them to be in Scotland, but they actually moved somewhere in England. You might not get that hint. You might have to go look for it. And one other thing that sometimes people don't realize, I think, is that hints, you kind of have to go through your hints, and then sometimes you get more hints if you evaluate the ones you have. then you're more likely to get more hints. So it might just be that you already have several hints in there you haven't looked at, and so nothing else has been generated yet.
Got
So
it.
that's a plug for, even if you don't know what the answer is on your hint, you can always click maybe. If you know it's wrong, go ahead and say no, and then that'll go away and it'll go back to our algorithm and say stop hinting this collection of information.
Right.
And that
Okay.
will help you.
Love that. Can I just get you to do a Control-Shift+ and just kind of magnify your screen as you walk through this
Yes.
for us? We've got some requests coming through for that.
Oops.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. So the downside of me having done that is this is a very long form.
Yes.
Anyone who has actually done a collection search before is going to be familiar with kind of this top of the page. We've got the the general search fields, which you're always going to see a name and a place. You're usually going to see a main event type. It might not be every event that's captured in there, but you'll see at least one. And then if there are relationships that are common, you'll oftentimes have the opportunity to put in additional family members, which with censuses is super helpful, because if you're looking for John Miller and his wife was Mary Miller and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to figure out which one this is, but their son was Egbert. You throw in Egbert and all of a sudden that's going to narrow down your search results, right? And then with databases like this, where we have a lot of additional information in there, we actually will include additional fields. These are usually fields you're going to use more if you're an advanced researcher. Not too many people are probably going to search by like the enumeration district name or the schedule type that you're looking for, but those are all in there. So if you are an advanced user, you've got the opportunity to do that. But a lot of them are really helpful, like nationality, like if you know they're Scottish, or occupation, if you know that they were a brick maker or something like that. If you're looking specifically for a child in the family, you can say that they're a daughter or a son. So there's a lot of little tips and tricks in some of these fields that are a little overwhelming at the bottom. So if you're new, just ignore those. Worry about the ones at the top. But then if you want to get a little fancy, there's opportunities down there too. The other thing I want to mention is this part of the right side of the screen. I don't know how many people on here have used the browse. It's a little bit daunting at first because it is literally like flipping through the books, right? This is not just searching and getting a record that comes up. This is your opportunity to like, okay, I want to walk through all the forms from this place, and I'm just gonna browse through image by image. And when you do that, you can see, so we have this ribbon on the bottom, and I'll show you all the things that are in there. Right now, I'm gonna minimize that because the screen's a little bit big. But you can see the image. And then if that's not the one you want, you go to the next one. Or if you want to see who filled out their form next to your family, you could do that. And then the other thing I wanted to introduce real fast before we kind of talk through the form itself is these forms are two-sided. So if you get a hint or you get a search result or you're browsing, this is the form you're going to see first. It's got all the people and all the great information on it. But go to the next page and you will see here's where they have the address. And it also shows you some information about how the forms were filled out. So it can give you more context about how they documented what's on the other side of the form if you have questions about what's in there. Just a really good quick reference to look at what's on there and why and kind of how they recorded things.
Hey, fantastic. So I'm seeing some questions, so I just want to clarify a couple of quick points. So one, for those of you who are following along from home, whether you're watching us live right now or whether you're watching the recording of this later and can hit pause on us, whether you are on Ancestry.com or Ancestry.co.uk or Ancestry.ca, all of those are just platforms from your respective countries into Ancestry. All of the data on Ancestry is the same, regardless of which platform you come into it from. Now, what determines whether or not you have access to this census is your level of subscription. And Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, the 1921 census is part of the UK subscription, yes?
Yes, so it's in the mid-tier subscription for the UK, Australia, Canada, and then the world subscription for US.
Okay, so just so if you're in the UK, you have to have or Australia or Canada, you have to have the mid-tier, not the basic subscription in order to access this. If you're in the US, it is part of the world or all access subscriptions. The US only subscription, obviously US only records does not have access to the UK records. So, so that's how you access it. So you just go on to however you access Ancestry. Under search, you're going to find the card catalog. Type in 1921, you'll see it come up, and you can follow along from home. Fabulous. Thank you, Lisa, for walking us through that. Now, Simon, there are a few other questions here, but before we get to those, I would love to know what you know about kind of just the history of the 1921 census in general. I understand there were some maybe oddities about this particular census, and it also has a particular significance.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting census. It's fascinating, actually, not just for what it can tell us about our families, but just the little quirks in there and the things that are included. So, for example, there are things like divorce, for example, is recorded as an official marital status for the first time, which is really interesting, and I think socially is quite fascinating to see as well. And rather poignantly, it's the first one where we see if a child was orphaned or not, which, of course, in the wake of the First World War, World War One, it's quite common to see. So that's quite poignant as well. But one of the things I really love, which makes the census stand out from previous enumerations, is the fact that if someone's out of work, in previous censuses, you might have seen out of work or unemployed written in their trade field, and you're like, well, it's not that helpful. It doesn't really help you that much. But now people were asked, if you're out of work, name your last employer, and that for me is so helpful when I'm looking at my family. At least I know, okay, they're out of work here in 1921 at the time of the census, but I knew what they were doing recently, and they're asked to record the address, the name and address of the employer. So you can look them up in maps, find out how close was the address to where they were living. Just things like that add this context. So that's really special. That's some new unique elements, and just like the 1911 census, 1921, the sheets, the forms that we're seeing in front of us that I'll maybe share in a moment with everyone at home, those are written in the handwriting of the head of the household. So you are seeing, that was filled out by potentially your ancestor, and that to me is really special. You see their signature, you see their handwriting. There's something very, very special about that. So there's some real amazing, unique elements of this 1921 census.
Yeah, there absolutely is. One of my favorite stories about the 1921 census has to do with the threatening labor strike that was happening. So one of the things about the 1921 census that is very, well, just about the England census in general, that is very particular is Census Day. Now, we have Census Day here in the United States, and theoretically, the census takers were supposed to ask the question as it pertained to Census Day. But we weren't quite as strict about it as the Brits were, wherein Census Day was you record exactly who was living in this place at this time on this particular night, regardless of when the form was filled out. Now, Census Day originally for 1921 was supposed to be in April, but there was a threatening labor strike. And so they decided to move it. There was that and some other factors. They decided to move it to the beginning of summer. And that meant a couple of things happened. One, it meant that the census takers that went around and collected this information because now they were out of school, was a high percentage of school teachers, which I find kind of interesting. But the more important thing is that there were people then who had already gone on holiday. So in April, most of them would have been at home, but by June, now we've got people on holiday. And so we see kind of a little tiny spike of people in some of the vacation or holiday places around the country instead of at their home on Census Day, because Census Day was shifted. So if your family is not living or not enumerated in the census where you might expect them to be, maybe check Bath.
It's actually kind of interesting also to note how many people have a visitor listed in their household, because it didn't have to be whoever was living there, it was just who was
Who was
there
there
that
that night?
night. So
Yeah.
if they were visiting family or something, they may show up at somebody else's house.
Right.
Kind of fun to look at.
Yeah, it's worth. But I love the fact that you bring that up, Krista. And actually, if you don't mind me sharing my
Please.
screen, we can have a look at that. So for at home, let's zoom in because, and these are some examples maybe we'll jump into later. But if I zoom in and tell me if this is clear enough, and if we can all
Yes.
see this at home.
Yep.
But how cool is this that it was supposed to take place in April, but as you quite rightly point out, the strikes, the labor disruption. So the form actually says Sunday the 24th of April 1921. So if you see that and you think, well, hold on, it took place in June. That's right. They just used the same form. So it kept, great, good on everyone for keeping it safe. Or you no need to print a whole new one out of a new date on. So you may see that, it may throw you just for a moment. But yeah, that's a really interesting historical cool quirk. But I mean, with the strikes going on, and I hope this is okay to go into a wider point, but at this time there was 2 million people unemployed in the UK at the time. So there was a huge unrest. So there is a wider point here, and you actually see that in the census. And if you don't mind me just scrolling down a bit further for everyone at home, you see this level of unemployment. And it's actually, I mean, I've had the privilege of spending hour after hour researching, particularly the impact of the war on the census, but you see this level of unemployment, and you see it amongst former soldiers. So we see here Richard James Bullock, and hopefully that's clear enough for everyone just to make out the entries. But we see the key information. But look here in his occupation section: discharged from the army, no occupation since leaving. And you
Wow.
think, we don't know exactly when he left. It could have been a year or 18 months less, but this was so common. I mean, of those 2 million that were unemployed were a huge number of soldiers that thought they were coming home to a land fit for heroes, and many of them couldn't find work. And it's the same for gentleman here, Harold Frank Patching. Same thing when I zoom in: no trade, army, out of work, discharged from army, November 1919. And actually, the fact that our family members are the head of the household, filled out these documents themselves, they can provide these little extra snippets. So you might see this, if it was an official, they may have just put out of work, discharged from army. The fact they put November 1919, as a family historian, that little snippet for me is just an extra entry in the timeline, an extra entry in their life that for me, it may seem like a small thing, but just, when you're looking at the census, just look out for little things like that, because it really, really does help. It really helps.
Yeah, I love that. While you're here on this screen, will you just go back an image to the cover? We're seeing some people ask, so I just want to clarify. This 1921 census is the first census
This one?
where you have this information about exactly who in the household filled out the booklet. So unlike here in the US, which was happening all the way through the 1940 census and into the 1950 census for most places, where a census taker is actually coming around and filling out the information. And what you're looking at is their handwriting or a copy of their handwriting. With the 1921 England census, we are looking almost always at the handwriting of somebody in the household. And if you go back an image, that's where you're going to see exactly who it is that filled that out.
I'm just going to correct that.
Please, please.
It's actually the image after. So
yeah, to the right hand side.
Sorry. Thank you.
Which I feel is odd, but that was just the way it was imaged.
Yeah.
So with the front of the form is got all the juicy details, and then the back side of the form is the second image. So
thank you for correcting me.
And you have the address here as well, which is really handy, because that's what we want. I mean, you might notice on the if I scroll back on the 1911 census, if you're at home, you may notice that you have the wonderful signature in the bottom right, but you'd also have the address. But remember, at home, if you think, well, where were they living? Like, where's their address? Just go, click right, go to the next page, and you'll have it here. And all this cool context as well. And you can see where it would have been folded and, folded into a nice kind of rectangle. But there's some great context on here as well. So yeah, it's just amazing to look at, isn't it? Like, it strikes you when you look at it. I think it's quite visually quite striking as well. Like, what an amazing record.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we're getting another question here about the form itself. So, two actually. So, one, Simon, you've mentioned the effect that the war had on
Mm.
the 1921 census and how we see kind of the circumstances of people in the country reflected. But in addition to the war, the Spanish influenza epidemic was sweeping the world. Do we see any indications of how that, the effects of that in the census as well?
Yeah, I mean, quite right. That's a really, really good point to bring up. I mean, you're looking at like 240, 250,000 in the UK killed. I mean, that's huge. On top of the almost 900,000 that died in the First World War. So you'll see that in perhaps those that are sadly missing from the census. I have to admit, I haven't dived deeply into those that were affected by the Spanish flu, but one thing I would do, and this is what I've done for World War One, when you're searching, and Lisa was showing us the form earlier, you might notice the keywords field. That's where for 1911 and 21, I searched for kind of interesting keywords. So that'll search like the whole form. And I would actually search for terms like Spanish flu or influenza, because you may see people making references. They might, you know, plugging ideas out, but you might see someone's mentioned that they got ill during the influenza or they were a nurse. You don't know. It's always worth searching because that's how I've come across lots of interesting entries for World War One, for those that served, for those that were war widows that we might touch on later. So yeah, a little tip at home if you're looking for, if you want to find just kind of interesting, quirky entries, use the keywords field and play around and see what you can find.
Love that. Okay. And then just another little quick question has to do with that marriage or orphanhood column
Yeah,
Lisa mentioned it, you've referenced it. I don't want to kind of jump ahead or get you lost in your tabs that you have so carefully organized here.
sure.
But do you have any examples of what might be written in that field for
Yeah. I think I might do. Let's have a look and see because I mean we may not get around to all of these, and it's very sad when you see it really because it's a lot of it is relating to those soldiers that were killed. So let's see if we can find. So I was researching somebody that was part of the War Widows training scheme. Let's see if we can find her. If not,
maybe
we'll
Lisa, can you search for something and maybe share your screen if that's a little easier?
yeah. And then one thing we have here actually
Oh,
is you'll
here we
see
go.
here mother or father both alive. So um, what you'll see is usually father dead, which obviously, or father deceased, or words to that effect, which is, obviously very sad to read. But you do see that. And yes, it's very sad and it feels quite blunt when you see it on there, father dead. But it helps us to understand why that person wasn't there in the census. So really, really useful. Like I said, lots of tabs here. They may be in here somewhere,
That's
but
all good.
it's yeah.
So what we're typically seeing in that field is going to be both alive for children, meaning both parents are living. We might see one that says father dead. We might see one that says mother dead. Mother dead
Mm.
is an interesting one I've come across a couple of times because there was a husband and a wife and a bunch of children. And then some of the children's status of orphanhood said mother dead, which was the only indication I had that that wife is not their mother. She was the mother of the younger children, but not the mother of the older children in the household. So pay attention to that field, y'all.
Yeah, and I mean it's another example of how useful this is to family historians. That the little clues you may think it's such a tiny thing to pick up on, but it's these little clues that can help you with the wider story here. There's so much you can take from this. And actually, this example jumps out at me. This is one that the name of the child. Some of the eagle-eyed at home you may have seen. Uh, Ypres, I think that's Mary or Maud. Ypres Maud Owls. Oh, now, Ypres, named after the town in Belgium that saw, incredibly fierce fighting during the First World War. And this is another impact we're seeing. I was searching the keyword field for battles. So I've seen people named after the Battle of the Somme, named after Ypres. And I was looking up these children and their fathers' wartime service in our military records. And actually finding that, yes, they served at Ypres or they served at the Somme. So you can see that the war impacted them so greatly that they're naming their children after these incredibly poignant, incredibly brutal battles of the First World War. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
Hey,
Okay.
Simon, while you're on that form, can you scroll over to the right?
Sure. A little
All
further
the
or
way over.
oh right, cool, cool,
All
sure.
the way, all the way over to these little boxes that are really
Yeah.
easy to ignore. Um, so I thought it was really interesting that they added this information into the census form. It is a place to note the children and their ages for anyone 15 or under. And it's a kind of a way to check because it'll show how many children they have if they have a child that's not at home. They might not be listed on the form, but they may be counted as one of the children in that box area. So if you are wondering where someone is, you can look. And if you want to check and make sure nobody, because there were, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I believe with some of the unemployment and stuff, people kind of dispersed sometimes, and with orphanhood, sometimes people dispersed a little bit and weren't always with their family, and not all the children would have been in the home all the time. So it's just a little tip to look for and check if there's anybody else that you might be missing.
Yeah. Or if, like, you're quite right, Lisa. I mean, or if with, families with large numbers of children, if they, were struggling to take care of them all, or, with unemployment so high, it may be that the children are living with the grandparents. So they were recorded here in this section, but you might find them living with an aunt or uncle or grandparent because, for economic reasons, maybe that was why they weren't in the household. So yeah, really, this again, an excellent addition, this last section for family historians.
Love that. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so Simon, before we dive into like a discovery or a story that you have prepared to share with us here, I do just want to answer a couple of questions and clarify a few things. So the 1921 census was mailed out to everybody, sent out to everybody for that April taking of the census for Census Day. And then, of course, because of some of the disruptions with some of the labor unions, everybody was mailed a postcard that told them that that was delayed, that the census would then be taken in June. And so technically, all the information on this form, the ages of the people, for example, should be based on the June date, but some people filled it out early. Some people, just like all censuses, whether it's here in the US or Canada or in the UK, people follow the instructions to the best of their understanding at any given moment, which means as family historians, we always need to just be a little bit flexible in how we understand that information. Ages may or may not be reported accurately. Names may or may not be spelled the way we expect them to be. Places of birth may or may not be completely accurate. It is all just a clue in the big journey of the puzzle of putting together the stories of our families and how they piece together. So yes, while there are rules, not everybody follows them or understands them the same way, which means we do have to look at these census records with that lens and that understanding.
Krista, that's a great point. Also, while we're talking about ages, I don't know that we mentioned that this is the first census that included months as well as years.
Yeah.
So it's going to give you might have to figure out if they calculated the months by April or June, but at least gives you a little bit of window to look for birth registry records and other things that might help you trace back a little bit further.
Yeah, great point. The other thing to note about kind of the taking of the census that helps you understand the records a little better as you explore them is that in the UK, because individuals were filling out the forms themselves, they still sent out census takers, and the census takers had two jobs. One primarily was to just collect the forms. The form was supposed to have been filled out by the day after Census Day, and there was a fine levied if you didn't have the form available when the census taker showed up to collect it, whether they showed up the day after or whether they showed up a week later. And so what we see in the UK census is a lot higher rate of return because of that fine that could be imposed. If the census taker showed up and you hadn't filled it out, because nobody in the household was literate or whatever reason, the census taker would help or could help you fill it out, which was why it was so important that school teachers were part of that force, was because they had, of course, the literacy and the capability of filling that information out for the household as they collected that form. So a couple of the questions we got was about the percentage returned, like really high return percentage because of the way that it was collected. And then also, what happens if people don't have the capability of filling out the form themselves. There was assistance rendered in that case. Okay, Simon, are we ready to dive into one of your stories?
Yeah, so in terms of stories, it's really like just examples I found that have stood out to me because, as I was mentioning earlier, I specialize in military research. Like my passion is researching people, our armed forces has been my background for a number of years. And let me share my screen because some of the examples I found quite poignant, but just really interesting and maybe relevant for like a number of people at home. So let's just share my screen and show where we're at. So I showed a few examples earlier as we were touching on other aspects. But one of the things I mentioned was the war widow. So by by um, by 1920, I think there was an estimate of around 240,000 war widows in the UK. And here we see Martha Bransfield, who lived in Newcastle in the northeast of England. Sadly lost her husband in the First World War. He died in 1917. And one thing that caught my eye was, was this in the occupation section, training for war widows. And she was involved in dressmaking, and it even indicates where. So touching on the point I made earlier, that it's going to actually say the name of the employer and where, and where. But training for war widows was something that I have to admit I wasn't overly familiar with, and having been involved in military research for a long time, the census really brought this to my attention, and it was that a Ministry of Pensions scheme that was brought in after the war, that the dependents or the widows of soldiers that were killed could be trained in certain skills to help bring an income for the family if they had lost the main income earner. So it's really interesting here that now 34-year-old Martha is going out to work and training and learning a new skill to provide for her family. Not only having to learn this new skill, but also then dealing with the loss of her husband. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm looking at the census, I was like, okay, well, what can I find? What other records can I find? Because the census is incredible for the here and now, for what does it tell us about our ancestors in this moment, but then we can use the clues to find out more information. So I looked at our amazing military records that we have on Ancestry, and I found in our British Army service records an entry for Martha's husband, W. Bransfield. Died on the 23rd of December 1917 at the 34th Combined Field Ambulance in the field. So it's giving you a location there. You can go into more detail and find the field ambulance, but died of smallpox due to field operations. I'm still working out exactly, there's so many pages in this file, where that was. But as you scroll from left to right, you even see a little bit of correspondence here, and amazing record. But that's one of the things I like to do is when I'm looking at someone in the census, I then look at the military records too. And we even see, going back to my first entry earlier for Richard James Bullock, the very first entry I brought up, I mentioned he was a discharged from the army, no occupation. I was thinking, okay, well, what was he doing? And I actually also found his British Army service record. I could see he was in the Royal Artillery. And for many of you at home, you've used these records before. This, if you are lucky enough to find a service record for your ancestor, because around about 60% were destroyed or badly damaged during the Blitz. But if you are able to find one, they're packed with information. And yeah, this provides a little bit more information. So we go from knowing in the census that Richard served in the army, to looking at his service record here, and learning a lot more about him. So just the little stories that you can pick out from the census. I mean, I have so many here. It's one of those things that I just love sharing these and finding more information. But even as I've mentioned, it's so many soldiers that were out of work. I mean, William Henry, I think it was Aldridge here, discharged out of work and wounded, many wounded soldiers too, of no occupation, and was pensioned. And you see, quite interestingly as well, the different charities that were set up after the First World War, the British Legion, or St Dunstan's, the hospital for blind soldiers, that you had different premises, and one in London as well. You see those that have been set up in the census, and you see the different patients there and the staff helping. Really interesting. So for me personally, the impact of the First World War is so visible. It's so prominent in the census. It's almost like a nation grieving, if you like. And as I said, there's so many examples we could look through. I mean, although it's very moving, I found it really fascinating. And looking at our female ancestors, of course, Women's History Month, we've been looking, for me personally, I've been looking at lots of examples of women during wartime. And we have here for Maud Breeze. Now, the reason I find this really interesting is Maud served. Maud was unemployed at the time of the census, but what I love is, and I'll zoom in, hopefully we can see it at home. The handwriting is lovely, actually. It makes it a little bit easier for us. But she was employed as a land worker during the war. So with what was known as the
Oh,
Women's Land Army, really, really important work during both World Wars. Basically, keep helping to do agricultural work, freeing up men for service in the armed forces, carrying out agricultural work, really, really tough laboring work, keeping food on the table. Now, it even indicates the farm, the name of the farmer, and the farm. Now, the thing I love about this is that, yes, there are Women's Land Army records out there, but sometimes you may not be able to find that information. And the fact that someone's recorded it on a census to me is quite special. And the fact we just know a little bit more now about Maud's wartime service, thanks to this very detailed census family member who filled out, who added this information. So yeah,
well, and
this story.
it's so interesting to me because like this is, you know, what, 2 years after the war ended, right? Like the fact that, you know, at this moment in time, she's working at home, but that somebody wanted to make sure that they recorded, you know, over the course of the last decade, this is how she contributed and made that notation. It kind of brings up like there's a lot of suffragette kind of movement happening at the same time as well over the course of that decade, and how that is, you know, have either of you seen how that's shown up in the census at all?
Yeah.
I don't have the example pulled up, but I know when I was first looking at 1921, I was kind of looking to see were there suffragettes, like famous suffragettes that we could find, and I actually found a couple of records of them like gathered together in a house on the night of the census. So you've got like three famous suffragettes, and one lives there, and two are visitors. So you could kind of see how they're gathering together and associating with one another, probably in a element of solidarity. So,
Yeah,
It's really
so
interesting when
interesting.
you compare like if you go back 10 years and look at the 1911 census, because we mentioned earlier that 1911 and 1921 and that we actually see the forms that our ancestors completed as opposed to the forms that they completed previously, and an official would write those up in a book, and perhaps if they were more rebellious or unorthodox answers, perhaps they were ironed out. Or so that's why in 1911 you see these incredible protest entries for suffragettes, because there was a protest, no vote, no census, and this was
mhm.
before women over the age of 30 were given the right to vote in 1918. So you see that. You don't see that. I haven't seen as many entries for suffragettes in 1921, perhaps logically because of although women over the age of 21 will be given the vote until 1928. Maybe that's why you don't see it in 21, but there is still room for finding these interesting entries. And I think I found Annie Kenny recently with her sister, who was a prominent suffragette, someone I've been really lucky enough to research. If at home you've not come across her before, just Google like the Kenny family, Kenni. I think it's IE or Kenny. Really, really interesting. Like they are a family of suffragettes, working class suffragettes from the Manchester area, hugely important in the suffragette movement. But you see them in the census as well, and yeah, it's amazing when you actually find them in the census. These historical figures, these people that you read about, and you find them in the census, and you think, oh, they're people as well. You know, they had lives, and it brings it to life. So yeah, have a look. Really, really interesting family.
Yeah, thank you for that. That history of the suffragette movement is so interesting to me because of the unrest we see and the protesting we see in the 1911 so clearly. But yet the suffragette movement was not fully over by 1921, and so to kind of see little hints of that in this census still as well is just kind of a fascinating snapshot of history at that moment in time. I love that. Okay, there's a couple of other questions here, and then Lisa, I'm going to ask you to share your screen again if you don't mind, and walk through a couple of searches specifically based on some of these questions. But before we get to that, Simon, as you were showing your examples from some of the census images, there were things, there's notations written, there's things written in like green ink on one of those pages, right? Like, can you just talk a little bit about like, you know, what that is that we're seeing? Some people have some questions about that.
Okay, I'm guessing for those at home, it must be. I've just opened my screen up again.
The green ink in particular
Yeah.
was what caught people's attention.
Now,
Coding.
I'm yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not 100% sure about the coding, so I will be honest there. I don't know, Lisa, if you've seen that before, but that is new to
I
me as well. But
Yeah, I don't know the exact like I don't have the dictionary for the coding, but that was pretty common in most censuses in the US, in England, across the world, that after they'd taken the census, when they were doing the statistical analysis, the census taker board, whichever country it was, when they were doing the statistical analysis, they would categorize particularly occupations, class of work, things like that, into specific categories so that they could kind of group them together and see, okay, we have this many farmers, we have this many dairy farmers versus this many goat farmers. I don't know. So you'll often see these kind of notations that have been added later that were used mostly for statistical purposes. If you're really curious about them, there are some dictionaries you can look up online to try to decode how they classified your ancestor afterwards. Generally, what you see on the form is going to be more detailed because they were just kind of putting them into a category that they could lump a bunch of people into.
Yes.
That's really
Great
interesting. I guess when you look at it closely and just stop, like, and pause and look at it, it is around occupations. So stating the obvious, it's got to be something to do with, like you say, Lisa, their line of work.
Yeah.
But I see that even on like military records, there's coding, there's shorthand, or like references that maybe have been lost over time because, you know, a dictionary hasn't been kept. That maybe for the people, the officials that were working on those documents at the time, that meant something. But, you know, all these years later, it's been lost, and we're like, well, what does it mean? So yeah, it's interesting. It's a good spot by whoever spotted that as well, because, you know, it's good to be curious and try and find every element, every scrap of detail from the census. So, yeah, it was a really good question.
You'll
Yeah,
also
for sure.
see, like, on that one at the bottom where they had written single, but the person was only 10, and the instructions said you were supposed to give the parent status if you were under 15. So they've crossed that out and wrote both alive. So sometimes you'll see too notations where they've said you didn't fill out the form correctly. This is what you were supposed to put here. And again, that was usually, I think, used for statistics and calculating like how many people were orphans versus how many people were single, and that was messing up their calculations if they didn't fill it out properly.
It's super. It's also
Fantastic.
like amazing looking at these these wonderful like occupations that of course we still see locksmiths now, and there are lines of work that we still see, but then there's something lovely about seeing like paper bag printer. There's something just really like it's just wonderful to think, you know, these lines of work that our ancestors were in, and some of the occupations that you find there that we may not see now, and you know, we can see how they've developed. I just think that's really interesting.
I've actually, a couple of the ones I thought were really interesting. They're not necessarily occupations that don't exist, but they're ones you don't necessarily think about. Like I found one family where all of them worked in chocolate making. So it was a confectioner, and then one of the children was a factory, like a chocolate packager, and then another, like they all had a role in the chocolate business. And it's just kind of interesting to see families that kind of shared an occupation together, and how they fit into the different roles in the family to support each other. Really cool.
Nice.
Love that. Okay, thank you for sharing that screen again, Simon, just so that we could understand a little bit about those. One of the things that people sometimes forget when they're so excited to find their ancestor in a census is that these records were not created for us as family historians. These records were created almost exclusively for governmental purposes. And so I've seen a few questions, you know, just kind of basic census questions. Censuses are taken every 10 years in both the UK, in Canada, in the US. In the US, we take them on the zeros. In Canada and the UK, they take them on the ones. It's just a choice of the government. There's no, like, you know, secret reason why that happens. But then the Census Bureau here in the US, I'm not sure what it's called in the UK, but they use that data, they compile that data to make decisions about running the government and meeting the needs of the people in the country. And so those notations are just a way for them to quickly go through, you know, millions of people and tabulate that information in an effective manner in order to use it for their purposes. So by the time we get it, here in the US, the privacy law is 72 years. So the most recent available census here in the US is 1950. In Canada, the privacy law is 90 years. So the most recent available census there is 1931. And in the UK, the privacy law is 100 years. So the most recent publicly available census there is this 1921 census. Now, Simon, the 1921 census has significance because in another decade and a decade after that, we're not getting censuses, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out actually, and I believe our equivalent is the Office of National Statistics here for the data. But yeah, you're right. Very sadly, the 1931 census was destroyed during the Second World War, and then the 1941 census wasn't taken because of the Second World War. So for many people, this is going to be the last census release for a generation. It's and that's what makes it, I think, even more special and even more poignant. So yes, you're right, but it is worth pointing out as well that if you are, there are other collections available. If you are looking for other records to research your ancestors around World War II, the 1939 register. It's not a census, but it's kind of the closest thing that we have to one during World War II, taken on the 29th of September 1939. An amazing snapshot of the civilian population. Doesn't include the military, includes civilians. So yes, we have this gap, so to speak, for between 1921 and 1951, but the 1939 register is a good stopgap in there if you are looking for something to research your ancestors.
Yeah, and that 1939 register, Lisa, if some of those records are redacted or have a black line through them, can you explain a little bit for people, as they go from the 1921 census, the logical next place to look for families is that 1939 register, why some of those records are redacted?
Yeah, so because it's less than that sort of 100-year privacy rule that the census falls under, 1939 is more recent than that, obviously. They've redacted the information of potentially living people. So if someone was born less than 100 years ago and they don't have record of them passing away, that line will be redacted. And pretty much every year we'll do an update to release the updated list where we remove the redactions of either those who have passed away, who were born after that 100 years, or that next year that's now available in the rolling 100-year privacy. So yeah, you may not find who you're looking for, but keep looking because you may see them come up as we move forward in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, Lisa, last couple of search questions for you. So,
Sure.
one, you talked about actually when you get into a set of images, being able to browse them. What order are these records in? Are they like here in the US, when you go down a census page, or in previous UK censuses, when you go down a census page, you're looking at the neighbors and you go to the next image and it's the next set of neighbors walking your way down the street. But because these were individual forms returned by people, have they been placed in some kind of order?
So similar to the US and to previous censuses in the UK and in Canada, they are organized by registration district, and within that district, a sub-registration district, and within that district, an enumeration district. So you've kind of got this like concentric circles of getting into the neighborhood, right? And similar to the previous censuses that were then compiled into a form and one address after another, they're not always completely in order because sometimes the census route said you were supposed to go up one side of the street and down the other and around the corner and then back. So really, if you're looking for somebody and you know where they should be, but you're not able to find them, you'll want to look in the enumeration district and the enumeration districts around them in case they were on the border of that. There's also some sub-district plans that you can go through. They're browsable. We're still working a little bit on the labeling on them, but they show kind of like what streets would have been in that enumeration district and some of the geological or geographical features of that area. So it could be really helpful if you know where they should be, but you just can't find them.
Okay, and where do we find that information in order to understand how the districts are laid out?
So I'm going to share it real quick. And this is where I'm just going to admit from our publishing side, we're not perfect and there are things we're still working on. So we're always trying to improve, guys. But if you go in the browse, so can you guys, is that big enough? Everybody can see that?
Yep. Yeah.
All right. You pick the county, you select, I'm just picking at random because I don't have one specific in mind. And then if you go to not stated, you'll get an all enumerations district. And this is actually the plan of the division. So that,
Fascinating.
and
I
that'll
didn't even
kind of,
know this was here.
yeah, and that'll walk you through like what was in that area, all the instructions for it. And then it gives you kind of the statistics on it, as well as like, okay, here's the parishes that were in there, the civil parishes, the ecclesiastical parishes, like all of these things are hints to you of where to look for more records, right? This is going to help you narrow down which church they might have been attending at the time, and maybe if they had a child who was like 1 year old, which church that child was baptized in or recorded in. So it's got a lot of really good juicy information. It does not have names in it, which is why you can't hint to it. And that's why I'm always like, don't forget to browse the images because there's so much to see that we can't hint you.
That may be the most golden tip you've given us all hour, Lisa. So let me just reiterate that for everybody. And this is true, I think, whether you're looking at the 1921 census or looking at other records on Ancestry. The beautiful thing about the card catalog is that the card catalog gets you to the database. And the database page, like Lisa just demonstrated, doesn't just allow you to have all the search fields for that specific set of records and what was indexed, but it has, if the images exist on Ancestry, that browse structure that sometimes gives you golden nuggets, just like this one, to be able to get to that information, to be able to understand more about the civil parish and the connection to the ecclesiastical parish, and where else that then is going to lead me to find more records. I love that so much. And yeah, I just want to encourage people, don't just use your hints, don't just search from your tree, but actually get into these records and explore them and play with them and see what else you can discover. Because like Lisa and Simon both have illustrated today so beautifully, there is a lot of information to discover, not just about your specific ancestor, but oftentimes about the community and the context of the country and history. And that helps you ultimately understand your ancestors and their stories better. So thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could keep talking to both of you for like another hour, probably.
Oh, that's the beauty of this collection. It's incredible, isn't it? And we all love family history, so it's so nice to be able to sharing this and just talk about this amazing collection.
Well, thank you for
It's
being
awesome.
here.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, all of you who are watching from home, or if you're watching the recording, you're going to want to back up just a few minutes and watch Lisa walk through that browse structure again. For those of you who are watching this live, we will have this video available on the Ancestry YouTube channel within just a few days so that you can go back and watch some of those important sections. We'll do our best to chapter it out so that you can find your way through the hour we just spent together to get to the bits that are most useful for you. And if this is the first time you've joined us, I do have a little assignment for you before you go. So if you would please, in the chat, not the Q&A, in the chat, just leave a comment about something new you learned today that's going to apply to your own family history journey. There's two reasons we ask for that. One is it helps us understand if we're delivering the content that's useful for you, if it's helping you in your family history journey. But also, because I'm an educator, I really firmly believe in the fact that actually typing it out and articulating it means you're more likely to remember it. And I really want that for all of you. So if you'll just take a moment and do that in the chat before you go, I would appreciate that. While you're doing that, let me just give you a quick preview of what's coming next. So if you go to ancestry.com/education, you'll see both our backlog of Wednesday virtual events, but you'll also see the next upcoming virtual events. And next Wednesday, that will be, what is the date next Wednesday? I should have had that up. It is going to be March 26th. So next Wednesday, March 26th, I will be doing a virtual event all about the new product feature that I had the privilege of announcing at the Roots Tech Genealogy Conference a couple of weeks ago, which is Ancestry Networks and how you can use that in your family history to continue to make more family history discoveries. So I hope you'll join me there. And until next time, again, Lisa, Simon, thank you for being here. And I'm Krista Cowan. We'll see you all next time.